Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in the recorded history of the Southern Highlands. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you first heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what hours these documented accounts arrive, because if the surviving records teach us anything, it's that time down to the minute matters more than we prefer to admit. In the winter of 1911, across the folded ridges and river-cut hollows of central Tennessee, a small settlement that appears on few maps today began to slip out of sight. Its absence is not accidental. By the following spring, notices of closure were quietly filed, property rolls reduced to dashes, and a cautionary line, "Do not reissue," was stamped in violet ink on a ledger that should have been dull with routine. The place had been modest to begin with. A clustering of timber houses along a split-rail road, a low steeple that caught the last light, and a single-room school where the windows rattled in the wind that poured out of the limestone breaks. The land was serviceable rather than generous, a gray-brown soil that demanded patience, but the people were known for that quality. And yet what the county summaries would later call relocation, others understood, even then, as disappearance. The first sign was recorded as a negative space, a silence where a voice should have been. According to a handwritten note in the mail ledger, dated November 28, 1911, several parcels marked for delivery returned to the shelf untouched. The clerk added a narrow mark in the margin, a habit he used to denote unusual patterns. He made it 3 times beside the page number, and then underlined the hour 9:17 p.m. Because that was when, for the second night running, someone called the office and said the name of the settlement, in a calm voice that sounded as though it had traveled a long way to arrive, and then said nothing at all. That voice was not the first anomaly. 4 days earlier, a farm account kept in a blue paper book ended mid-sentence during the tidy arithmetic of feed and salt. Earlier that week, the school attendance chart showed a sudden thinning row of empty squares, desks without their small weights, and slates wiped clean and propped like shuttered eyes. No one reported a quarrel, no fire was seen in the tree line, and yet the pattern of life had started to buckle, quietly, as if a seam had been picked from the inside. An official report did exist, but it has not survived whole. What remains is a carbon copy of the cover page with a name redacted by strokes of indigo pencil and the year circled twice. The bottom carries the typewritten phrase, "Field Evaluation, Pending Weather," and beneath it, in faint graphite, the notation, "If wind persists, abandon perimeter after 1 hour." That line has been read several ways, as caution, as protocol, and as a compromise between duty and fear. The weather did persist. Contemporary newspaper clippings from nearby towns speak of a cold season that arrived early, as if called "frost locked the gullies by October," and a repeated pattern of sleet that the older men called nail storms swept across the plateau in November. The river at the foot of the ridge bore an opacity it did not usually show until January, a skin so thin that stones thrown by boys skittered and chimed, the sound traveling farther than it had the right to travel. The parish register from the Valley Church, a long, spare hand that rarely permitted sentiment, allowed itself precisely one deviation from form. On the page where the dates of Advent ought to begin, there is a single sentence, "Keep your voice low, the hills carry." The settlements in those hills were accustomed to practical caution. Wolves in lambing season, sudden water through bottom fields, and lightning that sought the tallest oak every August and split it down. But a warning about speech rang differently. It sounded like a superstition that had grown teeth. One woman, whose writing survives because she was the sort to write everything down, kept a weather notebook, not unlike so many kept in that era. The height of the creek by noon, the feel of the day's wind, and the seams of cloud like ripped cotton laid west to east. In mid-November, her entries took on a steadier, more exacting rhythm, as though she had begun listening for something. She recorded the hour over and over, 9:11 p.m., and beside it wrote a single phrase, "Carries back wrong." On the following page, she drew a narrow rectangle to represent the north-facing window and inked a line of dots above it. 3 together, a gap, and 3 together, as if recalling a pattern from sound, to mark it as faithfully as she could. The schoolteacher, a precise man trusted with the community money box and the bolt keys, left a note in the desk for his substitute that reads like instructions from a habit begun without enthusiasm and continued anyway. Curtains drawn at dusk. No singing practice after the bell. Chalk trays covered. At night, do not stand between the mirrors. Mirrors were rare in those houses. More often, polished plates and panes that gave a person back as a suggestion rather than a declaration. The instruction seems odd until you hold it next to other fragments that survived little mentions of reflections that missed their cue by a blink or a breath, the sense that a returned image lagged, as if the glass were learning. If these details seem heightened, it is only because documents, once scattered and worn thin, compel the reader to connect them. The county summary is clipped and dismissive, a paragraph in an annual report concerned with yields and bridges. But the letters that people did not send, the drafts found under a lamp, and the journal margin where a word is crossed out and written again tell another kind of story, one that accumulates by inches and then, suddenly, jumps a yard. In that jump sits the winter of 1911. Sometime in the last week of November, a traveling pair, one a circuit rider with a notebook and a fondness for dates, the other a young man who could read landscapes the way a carpenter reads joints, reached the ridge road at dusk. The older man's notebook lists the milepost, the rise of the moon, the condition of the track, and then a short line, air thin above gully, mist close to ground, speech dull. He underlines the last 2 words twice, and then he does something else. He draws an ear and shades the inner curve, as if reminding his future self that listening can be an act of witness as much as sight. They stayed the night in the last house, before the road dips to the river, and though neither man left a formal account of what they heard, both left traces. The younger man's pack list ends with a late addition in a different pencil. Extra oil, extra wick, and a scrap of black cloth. The older man's sermon notes for the following Sunday begin with a text about speaking plainly, then wander as if a draft had been interrupted by another draft altogether. He writes, "Clarity is mercy. Say exactly what you mean, and do not give word shapes to whatever stands just beyond the fence." It reads as both exhortation and warning, both the fear that words might be building material for an unseen house. In the absence of a single authoritative report, we are left with latticed testimony. If you hold them at arm's length, the lines seem fanciful, the sort of embroidery that grows from a hard season and a closed road. But if you bring them closer and let the dates line up, a rhythm sets in, a narrowing, a pause, a doubling back, and the unmistakable sense that by the first week of December, the settlement had learned a rule no one wanted to learn. Speak less. Stand away from the window after dark. Keep the smallest mirror face down. Keep track of the minute hand. And yet, even in the discipline of that rule, something continued to answer from the slopes above the road. A sound that traveled through timber and stone and returned changed, as if carrying more than the voice that sent it. The official record resumes in the way most bureaucratic stories do, not with a confession or a discovery, but a discrepancy in paperwork. A December 6, 1911, inventory from the county supply office lists 2 lanterns and a box of fuses, requisitioned by an unnamed deputy for inspection north of Wilder Ridge. The following page records their return, marked incomplete, with a short notation in red. Equipment unfit for further use. Light source unstable. The phrasing is odd, especially for that time. Lanterns were not described as unstable. They were either cracked or functional, empty or full. Yet the same phrase appears again, a week later, in a telegraph from the same clerk to the state office in Cookville, reporting what he called atmospheric interference. affecting signal clarity after dusk. The message arrived as a string of partial words and unfinished sentences. Operators logged 4 attempts to resend before communication ceased at precisely 9:14 p.m. The weather that week was recorded as moderate low clouds, no wind, and temperatures near freezing, and yet by morning, the telegraph lines across the ridge were sagging as if under invisible weight. The section foreman, a man named Ransom, wrote in his log that when his crew attempted repairs, the wires vibrated faintly, like a plucked string, even when disconnected. He added, "There is a hum from the earth itself." His men refused to remain after nightfall. By mid-December, Wilder Ridge and the valley below were no longer sending correspondence or trade. The mail route, once a twice-weekly affair, was suspended after the last rider returned with a bag of unsent letters, each addressed to a name that could no longer be confirmed in census rolls. The postal supervisor, whose note survives only because he stapled it to a blank form, scrawled a final remark: "Return to file settlement deactivated." No one knew precisely what that meant or who had given the instruction. The first mention of what locals began to call the hum comes from an article in the Nashville Banner, published January 3, 1912. It describes a persistent droning perceived across several counties, likened to the low of distant cattle or the echo of a church bell muffled under snow. The article attributes it to seasonal temperature inversions and dismisses rumor. But in the same issue, in the public notices section, there appears a smaller item: missing 4 men, employees of the Jackson Survey Company, last seen en route to Wilder Ridge to assess mineral composition. Their equipment, according to a later follow-up, was discovered neatly arranged along the roadside. The compass needles inside their cases spun without rest for several hours before freezing in place. A surviving statement by the county judge in early 1912 mentions that the area was to be restricted for mineral stability assessment and that any remaining structures would be removed in the spring. When state inspectors finally made their way to the ridge, they found no structures to remove, only foundations overgrown with dry grass, and a well that reflected no sky. The foreman's log describes dropping a stone into the shaft and hearing no impact. He timed the descent for 21 seconds before noting, "Echo absent." Later that month, a team of 2 geologists from the university in Knoxville conducted tests in the area and filed an internal memorandum describing unusual magnetic readings, consistent with proximity to ferrous deposits, but variable with hour of day. They charted the fluctuations for a week, recording them at every half hour. The pattern stabilized briefly, then ceased altogether at 9:43 p.m. on January 14. Their next day's entry simply reads, "Equipment damaged, data lost, returning to base." Across subsequent decades, references to the site fade into brief mentions within mining surveys and county reports. It becomes a coordinate that cannot be reconciled, a section that auditors cross out, not because they believe it vanished, but because rechecking it costs time no one wants to spend. Yet fragments persist. In 1923, a road crew working several miles south unearthed what they first thought to be fence posts, but turned out to be wooden markers arranged in a line pointing northward. Each bore 3 notches, evenly spaced, then a gap, then 3 again. When the foreman asked the older laborers if they recognized the pattern, one man reportedly dropped his shovel and said he'd heard that same rhythm in the night air years ago. A slow, deliberate tapping carried by the wind from the ridge. He refused to work the remainder of the day. No photographs of Wilder Ridge from before its disappearance survive, though a single blurred image labeled Unidentified Tennessee Hillside, 1910, exists in the state archive. At first glance, it appears ordinary: a slope of winter trees, a few leaning fences, and a dark patch near the lower center. But enlargements reveal something stranger: a faint distortion, a wavering ripple that blurs the outline of the forest, as if light bends differently there. Archivists have debated whether the effect is due to motion or damage to the plate. The original photographer's notes are missing. By 30s, the story of the vanished settlement became regional folklore. It was told as a cautionary tale about isolation, pride, or divine judgment, depending on who repeated it. Yet, among geologists and surveyors, Wilder Ridge remained a silent footnote, a place where instruments failed and bearings grew unreliable. Some called it a magnetic false valley. Others whispered of subterranean resonance, a term without clear definition, but one that appears in several unpublished notes from the 40s, usually accompanied by sketches of concentric circles and annotations like frequency consistent with structural vibration. In 1951, a federal geological report listed the area as structurally compromised due to acoustic instability. That phrasing, nearly identical to the clerk's 1911 remark, light source, unstable, is the last official reference. Whatever had unsettled the lanterns, the wires, and the compasses had by then moved from rumor to classification. To this day, hikers who follow the old logging trails through that part of the plateau claim that sound behaves strangely there. Voices travel farther than they should. A cough from the valley carries to the crest. And always, when the wind calms, there comes a low resonance of 3 pulses, a pause, and 3 again, seeming to originate from beneath the limestone. Scientists who have tested the region's acoustics call it a coincidence, an echo from the winding river, or a quirk of the cliffs. But those who live near the boundary line don't need instruments. They know the pattern by heart. They close their shutters before dusk. And every so often, when the air grows still, they stop talking altogether, waiting for the hills to carry something back. By the time the century turned, Wilder Ridge had all but dissolved into rumor, a blank space on survey maps, and an uncomfortable silence in local history. Yet, in 1962, a field researcher with the Tennessee Valley Authority named Robert Lang found the first physical trace that would reopen the question of what truly happened there. Lang had been assigned to map water tables ahead of dam expansion projects. He was not a folklorist, not an investigator, just a methodical civil engineer with an ear for anomalies. In an internal memo dated July 3, 1962, Lang wrote that his team experienced persistent vibration in the ground while conducting soundings near the upper bend of the Obed River, directly adjacent to the coordinates once designated Wilder Ridge. He described it as a rhythmic, low-frequency oscillation that does not align with passing trains, aircraft, or river current. The field instruments, sensitive microphones known as geophones, captured what Lang called an acoustic signature of 3 beats, followed by a measured pause, repeating every 21 seconds. The recordings were logged, analyzed, and archived without public release. Lang's official report, which survived in photocopy, includes a hand-drawn waveform. Beneath it he scribbled, amplitude irregular, suggest subsurface cavity or mechanical resonance. When he returned 2 days later to verify, his team's readings failed to replicate the phenomenon. The signal had vanished. "It's as though something switched off," he told a colleague, according to a later interview. That colleague, an assistant named Carol Hayes, kept a personal journal of the expedition. Her entry for July 7 reads simply, "At 9:43, the ground itself seemed to hold its breath." The following autumn, Lang resigned from the TVA without explanation. His personnel file lists his departure as voluntary, though an unsigned note from a department superior warns that he had become fixated on unverified data from Site 11R. The next trace of him appears 9 years later, in 1971, when an article surfaced in the obscure Appalachian Geophysical Review. Its author, R.L., describes a recurring infrasound event in limestone strata, correlating historical accounts with temporal acoustic alignments. The piece was published without peer endorsement, and Lang, if indeed it was he, never wrote again. By this time, the Wilder Ridge myth had spread far beyond the plateau. Amateur historians linked it to Civil War-era tunnels, to spiritualist gatherings, and even to tales of pre-Columbian cults. Newspapers reduced it to a Tennessee ghost town swallowed by sound. But Lang's data prompted a quieter interest. In 1974, a letter from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory requested access to the same survey zone, citing unusual magnetic behavior affecting subsurface resonance experiments. The correspondence ends abruptly after a note of approval from the State Geology Board. What Oak Ridge did there is unknown, though locals remember the appearance of trucks marked with laboratory codes and the sound of machinery at night. From that decade forward, the area was fenced and marked with standard government signage: hazardous terrain, unstable ground, no trespassing. Yet people did trespass, and what they reported forms the next chain of fragments. In 1977, two graduate students from Vanderbilt's archaeology program attempted to locate remnants of the original settlement. Their expedition notes describe finding low stone outlines, suggestive of foundations, and glass fragments from early 20th century domestic use. But their most notable entry is not an artifact. It's a time. They wrote, "At 21:43 hours, felt a sudden pressure shift in ears. All ambient noise ceased for approx. 12 seconds. Light from the lantern dimmed, as if absorbed." Both students corroborated the experience separately in later interviews. They left the site that night and never returned. Their collected samples, stored at the university's geology lab, were misplaced during an inventory transfer in 1981. Meanwhile, regional residents, farmers, trappers, and surveyors spoke of hearing the hollow hum return around that same period. A pattern of reports emerged in local papers: livestock spooked without cause, clocks found stopped, and radios losing signal between 9:40 and 9:45 each evening. Most dismissed it as the imagination of small towns that had heard too many stories. Yet the accounts remained consistent in one detail: the sound always came from the northwest ridge, faint but regular, like distant machinery buried deep in stone. In 1983, a Nashville-based reporter named Evelyn Moore began assembling an investigative feature on what she called the Wilder Interval. Her research brought together the TVA documents, the missing surveyors from 1911, Lang's field notes, and even contemporary acoustic data from Oak Ridge. Moore's draft was nearly complete when she vanished. She was last seen leaving her apartment on December 9, 1983, carrying a brown portfolio. The next morning, her car was found parked at a scenic overlook 40 miles east, driver's door ajar, headlights still on. Inside the vehicle were maps marked with circular radii, centered precisely on Wilder Ridge, each ring spaced 21 seconds apart by sound delay calculations. Moore's disappearance became the newest entry in the ridge's growing legend. Her sister, who later gained access to Evelyn's apartment, found her tape recorder still running beside the typewriter. The tape begins with the clatter of keys, pauses, then captures a faint rhythmic pattern in the distance. 3 beats, silence, and 3 again before abruptly cutting to static. The device was examined by technicians who confirmed no interference, no malfunction. The sound, they said, had been external, environmental. For a brief moment, the Wilder case might have faded into mere urban myth again. But in 1989, 78 years to the day since the last known postal entry from the vanished settlement, state construction crews, clearing new power corridors, unearthed something beneath a collapsed gully near the ridgeline. It was a metal box, corroded but intact, sealed with wax. Inside were rolls of brittle paper, each marked in careful handwriting. The labels read, "Field Harmonics, December 1911. The documents, now held at the State Archive, include measurements of wind direction, barometric pressure, and acoustic intervals recorded every half hour for several nights. The name at the bottom of each page is the same: T. Simmons, supervisor. Historians later identified Thomas Simmons as a mine foreman assigned to that district in 1911, a man presumed to have died when the Wilder shaft collapsed that winter. Yet his logs describe not collapse, but experiment. He writes of testing the harmonic properties of the limestone cavities, and of a resonance below audible threshold capable of inducing vertigo and visual phenomena. On December 14, his final entry reads, "Apparatus successful. Sustained tone achieved. Human response uncertain. Will attempt direct observation tonight, 9:43. That was the last record in his hand. When archivists examined the logs decades later, they noticed something else: indentations on the reverse side of one sheet, as if the pencil had been pressed over another document. With angled light, they deciphered partial words. They answered. No one knows what Simmons heard that night, or whether the tone he generated still lingers under the ridge, folded into the rock like a fossilized echo. But since that rediscovery, the time 9:43 p.m. has acquired a peculiar significance. Acoustic researchers who test the plateau's resonance patterns often note equipment anomalies around that exact minute, and hikers who camp nearby report that the air grows dense, heavy, and faintly electric, as if the landscape itself is drawing breath. To this day, the site remains closed, marked as geologically unstable. But sometimes, when the wind is low and the trees stand still, a pattern rides the air across the valley: 3 taps, a pause, and 3 again, like a message that's waited more than a century for someone to answer. When the sealed documents from the gully were first catalogued, the archivists believed they had stumbled onto a mundane set of geological records. The handwriting was tidy, the measurements meticulous, and the paper type matched that used by state contractors in the early 1900s. But the longer the analysts studied them, the more the details began to resist rational context. Beneath the neat headings and measured intervals were recurring annotations written in a smaller hand, side notes that read more like confessions than data. Vibrations sustained at 18.9. One notation reads, followed by the phrase, "Human subjects experience altered cognition." Another page bears a marginal sketch of overlapping circles labeled wavefront convergence, and under it, in trembling pencil, threshold, confirmed. None of the official state reports from that era make mention of an acoustic experiment, nor of any apparatus resembling what Simmons described. Yet the accompanying diagrams suggest an elaborate network of brass pipes, copper coils, and weighted tuning forks suspended within the mine's central chamber. To modernize, it resembles a cross between a pipe organ and a scientific instrument designed not to produce music, but to shape sound itself. One of the recovered sheets bears a red-stamped heading, Wilcox Company Experimental Division. The name is now obscure, but period records list a mining magnate named Harold Wilcox, who controlled much of the plateau's mineral operations at the time. His correspondence, preserved in a private collection, mentions a joint venture with Dr. T.S. concerning the study of deep resonance phenomena and the potential industrial application of infrasonic transmission. Whether Dr. T.S. refers to Thomas Simmons or another figure altogether remains uncertain, though the coincidence of initials has not gone unnoticed by researchers. Among the box's contents was a thin notebook separate from Simmons's logs, written in a looser, less technical style. Its author is never identified, but the writing alternates between detached observation and personal dread. The first entry, dated November 19, 1911, begins with the words, "We hear it even when the instruments are still." Later passages grow more desperate. Wilcox insists it is only vibration through stone, but the tone carries shape. We see it in the lantern light. The air thickens where it passes. The final line before the journal cuts off reads, "Do not remain below when it aligns. They are drawn by the sound." The notebook was transferred to the State Historical Repository in 1992 under restricted access. For nearly a decade, it sat unexamined until a graduate researcher, cataloging the 1911 mining records, rediscovered it. His notes record that the notebook's cover had absorbed some kind of metallic residue, fine copper dust embedded in the leather grain, faintly iridescent under lamplight. When he brought it to the lab for chemical analysis, the copper traces produced a low hum through the spectrometer speaker. Despite no electrical input, the technician assumed equipment fault and replaced the unit. The hum ceased. That researcher, identified in university records as Dr. Michael Hart, later produced an unpublished paper titled Resonant Geology, the Wilder Ridge Event and the Architecture of Sound. The manuscript was never accepted by journals, but copies circulate privately. In it, Hart argues that the 1911 miners inadvertently discovered a natural resonance chamber, a formation where limestone density and subsurface caverns created a standing wave of 18.9 hertz, just below the threshold of human hearing. Exposure to such frequencies, he suggests, could induce vertigo, visual distortions, and even feelings of presence. What disturbed Hart was not the physical effect, but the timing. He found that Simmons's measurements, transcribed across 7 nights, corresponded precisely to astronomical positions of the Moon and Saturn. Hart proposed that Wilcox's operation may have synchronized their machinery to these intervals in an attempt to amplify the resonance, treating the mine as a vast tuning cavity. He called the event the Wilder Experiment, a convergence of geology, acoustics, and human curiosity that ended when the vibration became self-sustaining. In his closing paragraph, he writes, "If the accounts are accurate, they created a tone that outlived them, a sound that continued without source, echoing through the strata itself." Shortly after submitting his paper, Hart withdrew from the university and relocated out of state. In an interview years later, a colleague recalled that Hart had become convinced the resonance persisted. He said he could still feel it, the colleague reported. He claimed the frequency followed him, that at 9:43 every night, the glass in his windows would tremble, and his dog would growl at nothing. Hart's house burned in 1998, under circumstances never fully explained. The remains of his audio equipment were found fused, as though exposed to heat far beyond normal combustion. It might have ended there, an academic curiosity swallowed by local superstition, had it not been for the rediscovery of a cylinder recording labeled Wilder Test 4. The cylinder surfaced in 2003, donated anonymously to the Tennessee State Museum. When archivists played it, the first 30 seconds yielded only static hiss. Then, faintly, a pulse, 3 tones, a pause, and 3 more, repeating. At the 34th second, a man's voice can be heard saying, "Hold steady. Do not speak when it peaks." Then, silence. The recording ends abruptly with a metallic knock, and what some listeners claim is a single drawn breath. Audio experts who examined the file found no evidence of forgery. Spectral analysis revealed that beneath the audible range lay a subharmonic pattern centered at 18.9 hertz, the same frequency Simmons had noted in 1911. Attempts to replicate it under laboratory conditions resulted in immediate physical discomfort among participants, headaches, nausea, and in one instance, fainting. The test was discontinued. To this day, no one can explain why the Wilder frequency manifests with such consistency in every surviving trace. Geological surveys attribute it to localized infrasound generated by subterranean hydrodynamic flow, a phrase meant to close the matter. Yet the simplicity of that answer feels dishonest when weighed against a century of testimony describing more than vibration, describing awareness, as if the sound were listening back. When the museum stored the cylinder in a temperature-controlled vault, security staff reported a recurring issue with the room's motion sensors. At random hours, primarily between 9:40 and 9:45 p.m. The system registered movement directly above the sealed case. No visual footage accompanied these triggers. One guard, interviewed off the record, said he began hearing a faint tapping each night just before the alarm blinked. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. It wasn't the building, he said. It was under the floor. The cylinder remains in storage. The museum denies any anomaly, but the archived audio circulates quietly among researchers, each replay an experiment in curiosity and endurance. Those who listen long enough claim they begin to sense a pressure behind the sound, as if the room itself were leaning in, as if whatever answered Simmons in 1911 has not stopped speaking, only learned to wait for better ears. In the years following the rediscovery of the Wilder cylinder, public attention toward the mystery waned once again. The story settled into the margins of Tennessee folklore, a whisper shared by locals, half lost in the static of regional radio programs and late-night call-in shows. Yet within certain circles of academia and sound research, the case persisted like an irritant that refused to heal. It was in 2007 that the next thread began to unwind, when a doctoral candidate from Vanderbilt University, Elaine Parker, petitioned for limited access to the Wilder archival box, under the guise of a thesis on historic industrial experimentation in early Appalachian mining. Parker was meticulous, soft-spoken, and skeptical of anything that hinted at the paranormal. In her proposal, she emphasized her goal of reconstructing the technological process Simmons might have used not to prove myth, but to clarify method. The museum granted her 2 weeks access in their climate-controlled vault. She cataloged each surviving page, sketch, and photograph, creating digital scans for preservation. But her private notebook, recovered later from her apartment, contains entries the museum never saw. The earliest of these reads, "Copper dust is still faint on the paper edges. Each sheet smells faintly of ozone, like struck flint." Another, dated August 12, records, "Cylinder replayed for calibration test. Audio drops at the 9:43 mark each time the playback meter freezes and restarts at 9:44. Checked equipment, no fault." Her final entry, written in uneven handwriting, contains only 3 words. It's answering back. Is Sprek Lee 10? Parker vanished on the 2nd of September, 2007. The last footage of her shows her leaving the museum at 9:11 p.m., carrying her laptop and a small portable recorder. When security entered the archive room hours later, the lights were still on, and the recorder she'd been using lay on the table, still running. The playback contains a sound identical to the 1911 cylinder, but layered with a pulse within a pulse, the same 3-3 rhythm, accompanied by a deep oscillation almost too low to perceive. Audio engineers who examined the file described an impossible interference pattern, where 2 identical signals seemed to be out of phase by fractions of a second. "It's as if the echo arrived before the source," one technician said. In the weeks after Parker's disappearance, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation conducted a cursory inquiry, declaring no evidence of foul play. Her family pressed for more, but officials closed the case under the term voluntary absence. The museum quietly sealed the Wilder materials once again, placing them under indefinite restriction. Yet inside academic circles, copies of Parker's scans began to circulate. What they revealed was startling and far more complex than previously understood. The diagrams drawn by Simmons and his team weren't confined to mining layouts. They included precise geometric figures, overlapping arcs and spirals annotated with angular notations, and a peculiar trinity of marks: 3 vertical lines followed by a gap, then 3 more. The symbol recurs throughout the notes, even carved into the wood of the sample box recovered from the gully. It appears beside the phrase "resonant interval," confirmed, and again under a passage that reads, "Auditory field, unstable." Perception phase shift begins at 9:43, precisely. Sound physicists who reviewed the material concluded that what Simmons was measuring wasn't simple vibration, but a standing infrasonic wave that could, theoretically, distort spatial perception at sufficient amplitude. A report from Oak Ridge in 2011 quietly corroborated this. It stated that long-term exposure to certain sub-19 Hz frequencies produced momentary spatial disorientation and vivid photic hallucination in field personnel. Though couched in scientific language, the implication was clear. The wilder tone had measurable effects on the human mind, but the deeper implications emerged when Parker's scans were compared against modern satellite imagery. Her maps aligned with the present-day ridge contours, yet one coordinate, a depression northwest of the original mine, matched an anomaly recorded by U.S. Geological Survey magnetometers, a narrow ellipse of high magnetic deviation exactly 18.9 meters wide. The coincidence of measurement, the number echoing Simmons's recorded frequency, unsettled even hardened skeptics. In 2012, a small independent film crew sought to document the area, hoping to revive interest in what they called America's quietest haunting. They secured permits to film along the public boundary of the ridge, but were warned by forestry officials not to cross the fence line. Their footage, later released in fragments online, shows fog creeping low through the hollows, the silhouettes of the abandoned telegraph poles still standing like blackened sentinels. Near midnight, one camera captured a faint vibration in the soil, subtle at first, then rhythmic. The operator remarks, half joking, "That's 3 to 3, right? Maybe it's just our generator." Moments later, the frame wobbles as if struck by pressure. The sound peaks, and all devices cut out. The crew returned the following morning to retrieve the remaining equipment. Every battery was drained, and every watch stopped at 9:43 p.m. The footage ends abruptly, but the audio track preserves the last seconds. A deep resonance rising beneath the natural wind, followed by what one analyst described as a human voice folded within the frequency, as though spoken through stone. It was around this time that reports from nearby towns increased. Dogs barking at empty fields, window panes quivering at night, and children waking to rhythmic thuds they claimed came from the hills. Most dismissed it as collective imagination, fueled by internet rumor, but older residents recognized the pattern instantly. "It's back," one man told a local paper, "and it's calling in time again." In 2015, a group of acoustic engineers from the University of Memphis attempted one final controlled study under government supervision. They deployed subterranean microphones and vibration sensors along the western ridge, intending to isolate natural resonance from environmental noise. For 2 nights, the data remained unremarkable. Then, on the third evening, sensors began detecting a coherent signal, faint but uniformly beginning precisely at 9:41 p.m., growing in amplitude until 9:43, then vanishing. The recorded frequency was 18.9 Hz. The signal repeated over the next 6 nights, always between 9:41 and 9:43, always with the same rise and fall. The lead researcher, Dr. Julian Rivers, initially suspected equipment resonance from wind or underground water. But when the weather shifted and the signal persisted even under calm, dry conditions, his tone changed. "This is structured," he said in his final field note. "It behaves like intent." The 7th night produced the last usable data. At 9:43, all instruments captured a simultaneous burst of ultrasonic feedback far above their operating range. A single harmonic spike that lasted 1 second. The team's cameras recorded nothing visible, but a nearby motion sensor logged a mass displacement equal to several hundred pounds directly above the borehole where the microphones had been placed. The next morning, when the team retrieved the gear, the ground around the borehole had hardened into a smooth glaze, as though fused. No explanation has ever accounted for that effect. The study was classified, and its results were suppressed under environmental security clauses. Dr. Rivers later withdrew from academia entirely. In an email to a colleague before resigning, he wrote, "It's not an echo, it's a response." Even today, those who camp near the old fence line say that the woods grow unnaturally quiet after dark, and that even crickets and owls fall silent, as if waiting. Some describe a vibration through the soil strong enough to blur the reflection in a pool of water. Others, a rhythm felt through the ribs rather than heard by the ear. And every account, from 1911 to now, aligns in one immutable detail: the hour and the minute. 9:43. Always 9:43. Whatever happened beneath Wilder Ridge more than a century ago, it has never stopped repeating itself. It has only learned the patience of stone. The Wilder investigation might have finally dissolved into academic obscurity if not for the unexpected discovery made in 2018, when heavy rains triggered a partial landslide on the northwestern slope of the old ridge. The collapse exposed a narrow fissure that hadn't been visible since the early 20th century. Two hikers from Crossville, unaware of its significance, followed the crack into a shallow cave, filming their descent on a phone flashlight. The footage, later verified by authorities, shows a chamber roughly 12 feet wide, with limestone walls etched by pick marks and the rusted remnant of what appears to be industrial piping protruding from the stone. The hikers described a metal smell in the air and a faint vibration through the floor, like the hum of distant power lines. When they reached the far wall, their light revealed something else: an embedded brass plate, blackened by age, bolted into the rock. Though the surface was corroded, 3 vertical grooves were clearly visible, followed by a blank space, then 3 more, an exact replication of the pattern found in Simmons's notes. Before either man could examine it further, the phone's light flickered, and the video abruptly ended. According to their later statements, a deep pressure wave filled the chamber, accompanied by what they both described as a tone that didn't sound like it came from anywhere. They fled. The Tennessee Geological Survey sealed the site within a week, citing safety hazards, though one internal memorandum later obtained through public records requests reveals that agency officials had already been aware of unusual subharmonic resonance events in the area and had preemptively restricted excavation. The document mentions public sensitivity to prior incidents and recommends all findings be classified under infrastructure evaluation to prevent folklore contamination. By 2019, word of the sealed cave had spread online. Amateur investigators and YouTube explorers descended on the surrounding forest, posting night recordings of what they claimed were response tones emanating from beneath the ridge. The most circulated clip captures 3 dull pulses followed by silence, then 3 again. But buried within that sound, audio analysts later isolated a higher frequency, a faint modulation rising and falling, resembling human breath slowed to a mechanical rhythm. The discovery reignited academic interest and drew attention from an unlikely quarter, a private research group calling itself Threshold Acoustics Institute. The institute's founder, Dr. Howard Kess, was a retired physicist from Oak Ridge who had studied low-frequency sound phenomena for naval applications in the 70s. In a rare interview, he claimed the Wilder tone represented a persistent, self-organizing resonance. According to Kess, the frequency at 18.9 Hz was not arbitrary. It matched the natural oscillation of human eye fluid, capable of inducing subtle visual distortions. Prolonged exposure, he said, can trick the brain into perceiving movement or presence in stillness. But Wilder goes beyond that. It's as if the environment there is playing back what listens to it. Under controlled conditions, Kess's team began broadcasting narrowband signals into the sealed ridge using deep-range transducers. For 6 nights, they received nothing unusual until the 7th. The monitoring equipment registered a reflection signal that did not correspond to their emission. It arrived 1.7 seconds early. Kess's log reads, "Received return before transmission. Temporal inversion. unexplainable. Pattern identical to 1911 intervals. Subsequent analysis found the return was not identical at all but slightly altered. Phase shifted in a way that produced harmonic interference, identical to Parker's final recording from 2007. What Kess and his team documented next remains controversial. During playback of the reflected tone, multiple instruments in the lab began to vibrate spontaneously, as though excited by the same frequency. Metal brackets hummed, and clipboard clips rattled. The team evacuated the facility, fearing structural damage. When they returned, the recording equipment, powered down and disconnected, had somehow reactivated, red light blinking, capturing 43 seconds of ambient sound. Within that recording, a faint voice is audible, a man whispering what some listeners interpret as, "It's still open." Kess refused to confirm this publicly. The institute ceased operations weeks later. In 2020, an investigative journalist named Laura Bennett published a long-form article titled "The Tone Beneath the Hills," tracing the story from Simmons's 1911 experiments to modern classified studies. Bennett's research uncovered documents suggesting that the Wilcox Company had filed early patents for acoustic communication through geological mediums, hinting at a commercial motive behind Simmons's work. But deeper in those filings, Bennett found a chilling addendum, an unsubmitted draft patent titled "Method for Inducing Controlled Resonant Entry Through Harmonic Convergence." It described using synchronized vibrations to create temporary perceptual displacement between observer and environment. Scrawled across the draft's margin, in a handwriting that did not match the typist's, were the words "Perception is the barrier." Bennett's article ran for less than 24 hours before being pulled from the publisher's site. She later claimed the takedown was due to factual disputes, but colleagues said she had received legal warnings citing national security. In her final interview before leaving journalism, she described visiting the sealed Wilder site one last time. "There's nothing there anymore," she said. "Not even silence. It's like the world folds in on itself for a moment, and then you hear 3 tones, a pause, and 3 again, always at the same time, always listening." That same winter, maintenance crews repairing a remote radio tower 15 miles south of the ridge reported equipment malfunctions that seemed oddly synchronized. The tower's oscillators began to self-tune at 18.9 Hz, creating a slow sub-bass tremor, audible even at ground level. The technicians shut down the generators, but the vibration continued for another minute before stopping precisely at 9:44 p.m. "It was like something else had control of the frequency," one operator recalled. When the Federal Communications Commission investigated the incident, their report described it as anomalous coupling between structural harmonics and atmospheric pressure gradients. But buried in the appendix was a single line that few noticed. Notable correspondence with legacy acoustic data from the Wilder site. Recommendation: cease broadcast testing between 9:40 and 9:45 local time. By 2021, the ridge and surrounding valley had been absorbed into a federal research preserve with no public access. Locals who'd lived their entire lives within sight of its tree line woke one morning to find new warning signs and fencing that stretched for miles. The official reason? Ground instability. The unofficial one was whispered in gas stations and diners that the tone had grown stronger. Nighttime hikers still trespass near the perimeter, drawn by curiosity or disbelief. Many bring recorders. Most capture nothing. A few return with low-frequency hums. Their microphones can barely register pulses that oscillate at the same rhythm as those first documented in 1911. One hiker's account, posted anonymously online, describes an experience consistent across every era of testimony. At 9:43, everything stopped. No wind, no insects. My breath came out visible even though it was summer. Then the ground trembled, not like an earthquake, but like something under its shifting position. I felt a pressure in my chest, and then I heard it. The sound wasn't loud, but it filled everything. I thought it was outside me, until I realized I could feel it inside my head. 3 pulses. A pause. 3 more. And for a moment I understood why they built the machines. They weren't listening to the Earth. They were listening through it. His recording ends abruptly there. The last frame of the video shows his watch face glinting in the dark. Stopped at 9:43. More than a century has passed since the first tone was heard beneath Wilder Ridge. Yet the pattern holds precise, patient, and indifferent to time. No matter how many fences rise or files are sealed, the hills remember. And when the night deepens, and the minute hand reaches that familiar mark, the air begins to hum again, carrying a message no one alive yet understands, waiting, as it always has, for the next one who dares to listen. By early 2022, the Wilder site had achieved a strange dual existence, officially non-existent, yet increasingly visible in digital rumor. Government websites scrubbed references to it, while online communities began mapping acoustic blackout zones across the region using leaked GPS coordinates and anecdotal reports. Patterns emerged, concentric and deliberate. Every circle traced back to the same geographical heartbeat, the sealed ridge, once known as Wilder. That spring, a Tennessee State University research initiative quietly appeared in the Department of Earth Sciences budget under a vague title, Low Frequency Environmental Monitoring. The project lead, an acoustician named Dr. Daniel Mercer, claimed it was intended to measure subsonic interference from highway construction. But emails later obtained through a whistleblower revealed the true target. They were tasked with verifying whether the persistent signal, first documented in 1911, maintains coherent phase alignment in 2022. The directive came not from the university, but from a contractor whose address linked directly to Oak Ridge National Laboratory. The team installed seismic microphones along a 12-mile perimeter and began continuous recording in May. For the first 2 weeks, they captured nothing unusual. Then, on May 17 at 9:43 p.m., all 12 sensors registered an identical pattern: 3 pulses, a pause, and 3 more. The event lasted 42 seconds. When the data was reviewed, Mercer noted something chilling. Each pulse was separated by exactly 18.9 seconds. The coincidence of number and frequency did not escape him. His log entry reads, "Signal corresponds precisely with historical data from 1911 and 1962. No known natural mechanism is consistent with this periodicity." When Mercer submitted his interim report, he received a single reply from the contracting agency: cease all field operations pending further instruction. But the team, unable to let the mystery rest, continued gathering data unofficially. On the 6th night of their unauthorized recordings, a pattern shift occurred. The pulses increased in tempo, rising beyond measurable frequency bands until their instruments began emitting a faint, metallic whine. At that same moment, the on-site generator cut out. According to Mercer's assistant, the silence that followed was unbearable. Not empty, but dense, as if the air had thickened into water. Then came what she later described as the inversion. Every digital clock on their devices began counting backward, the timestamp reversing from 9 hours 43 minutes and 12 seconds to 9:42:59 before the screens went black. The phenomenon lasted less than 10 seconds, but when power returned, they realized their recording had jumped forward 1 full hour, leaving 59 minutes of corrupted data replaced by a uniform static tone. Mercer attempted to reconstruct the missing hour by spectrographic analysis. Hidden within the static, he found something resembling speech, vowels stretched and folded into impossible pitches, too slow and too low for any human voice. When he played the pattern at accelerated speed, a phrase seemed to form, though no 2 listeners agreed on what it said. Some heard, "not gone," others, "not yours." Mercer heard nothing at all. The playback triggered severe vertigo, and he collapsed. He recovered enough to write a brief note to his department chair before resigning. "It isn't noise. It's a language older than us and patient enough to wait for translation." Within a month, he vanished. His house was found undisturbed, dishes drying in the rack, lights still on. The clocks inside had all stopped at 9:43. In the wake of Mercer's disappearance, Oak Ridge issued a statement denying any connection to his project. But in October 2022, a classified environmental assessment filed under the Freedom of Information Act revealed the installation of acoustic dampening pylons across the region. Vertical rods sunk deep into limestone to absorb low-frequency resonance. On paper, they were meant to prevent landslides. Locals knew better. They began calling them the pins. Residents reported an eerie consequence. Once the pylons were in place, nights became oppressively silent. The hum that had haunted generations ceased, replaced by an absence so profound it felt wrong. Dogs stopped barking after dark. Radios emitted faint background clicks between broadcasts. Even the river seemed to move slower, as if the entire valley were holding its breath. But the quiet didn't last. On the 3rd of January 2023, every sensor in the dampening network recorded a sudden reversal. The absorption pattern flipped. Instead of soaking up the resonance, the pylons began emitting it. For precisely 1 minute, the valley filled with a vibration strong enough to rattle windows 20 miles away. Emergency services logged hundreds of calls about a deep pressure wave and the sound of metal twisting underground. Then at 9:44, it stopped. The next day, maintenance crews sent to inspect the pylons found all 12 installations intact, yet altered. The copper caps had deformed inward, as though drawn by vacuum rather than heat. Their surface carried 3 parallel scratches, each exactly 18 millimeters apart. Around the same time, seismic instruments across the state recorded a faint tremor emanating from the Wilder region, not large enough to qualify as an earthquake, but distinct enough to travel hundreds of miles underground. The U.S. Geological Survey attributed it to seasonal shifts in groundwater pressure. But a private lab in North Carolina, analyzing the waveform, noted that its pattern did not match tectonic movement. It was musical, not chaotic, but rhythmic. At 9:43 p.m. that same evening, residents in 3 separate counties reported simultaneous blackouts. Witnesses described seeing the stars themselves flicker, as if the entire sky had shivered. Amateur radio operators monitoring low-frequency bands captured a short transmission before their signals cut out. 3 bursts, silence, and 3 bursts, followed by a final tone at 18.9 Hz that continued for exactly 60 seconds. Within 24 hours, the official narrative solidified. The Department of Energy issued a public advisory, blaming testing of experimental communication arrays. But those who lived through it knew the truth. The hills had spoken again. The following week, a security contractor performing thermal imaging over the ridge captured an anomaly in the soil, an oblong zone radiating residual heat in the shape of an ancient tunnel. At its center, a single cold spot persisted, a void where the temperature dropped 17 degrees below the surrounding stone. When the technician enhanced the contrast, the cold region formed a near-perfect circle. Inside that ring, a faint symbol appeared. 3 lines, a gap, and 3 more. Officials dismissed it as camera interference. The technician quit his job the next day, leaving a note taped to his monitor, the ground still breathing. By spring, a kind of uneasy truce returned. The fences remained, the pylons hummed quietly under soil, and the town beyond Wilder Ridge carried on as though the century-old legend had finally been buried. But those who stayed close to the boundary swore that something beneath had changed its rhythm. Slower now, deliberate, almost conversational. At dusk, some claimed they could hear fragments of melody woven into the hum tones that rose like a question and fell like a reply. And always, the same pulse marked its beginning and end. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Not calling, not warning, but waiting as though the echo that began in 1911 had finally found something listening on the other side. In late 2023, a team from the National Acoustic Research Consortium was granted controlled access to the Wilder exclusion zone under the pretext of verifying soil stability for infrastructure planning. Their true directive, however, was to measure persistent harmonic anomalies that had resurfaced after the January resonance event. For reasons that remain unclear, the mission logs from this study were never released through official channels. What has surfaced comes from a single external hard drive, anonymously sent to a Nashville newspaper months later, an archive labeled simply Project Gate. The first recordings begin normally: wind through trees, faint chatter between field technicians, and the ambient murmur of distant machinery. But then, abruptly, all environmental sound ceases. The microphones register a low tone at 18.9 Hz, sustained for nearly 1 minute before modulating upward. When slowed, the signal spectrogram reveals an intricate waveform asymmetry, too complex to be geological. At precisely 9:43 p.m., the tone splits into 2 harmonics, alternating in phase. A faint voice is captured over the radio, breathless but calm. "We have contact on both channels." That voice belongs to lead researcher Dr. Alice Munro, an acoustic physicist whose prior work focused on standing wave interference. Her field journal, partially recovered from the hard drive, documents an escalating unease during their 5-day deployment. The first entry reads, "Signal localized beneath coordinates 36.18 newtons, 84.91 watts Old Ridge Center. Harmonics exhibit recursive phase shift. Origin unknown." The later entries, however, take a darker turn. Day 3. Subsurface mapping complete. Cavities extend deeper than expected, roughly 600 feet. Pressure readings fluctuate with lunar position. The crew reports auditory illusions of whispers matching pulse intervals. Recommend ear protection. Day 4. We detected a secondary frequency at half amplitude. It's not random. It's imitating our call pattern. The system is responding in kind. Day 5. 21:43 hours. Field resonance reached critical harmonic. Temperature dropped 12 degrees in 40 seconds. Visual distortion observed near the fissure. The air appears to bend. We recorded it. Reviewing playback now. The final page of Munro's journal contains only a short line, scrawled in graphite, the pencil pressed so hard it nearly tears the paper. "Do not answer again." What happened after that night is uncertain. The research team was scheduled for extraction at dawn, but when the transport convoy arrived, the camp was empty. Equipment stood neatly stacked beside the fissure. The generators were still running. Every clock, camera, and data logger displayed the same frozen timestamp, 9:43 p.m. The only living trace of the team was a stray radio transmission captured 2 miles away by forestry rangers. It lasted exactly 23 seconds and contained what analysts describe as unintelligible phonemes modulated over low-frequency carrier waves. When filtered, the sequence translates to 6 syllables in a repeating cadence, a pattern resembling human speech, but with unnatural symmetry. 3 days later, rainfall flooded the access path, sealing the fissure again under rock and silt. Officials attributed the disappearance to a catastrophic collapse, though seismographs recorded no movement large enough to explain such destruction. In the months that followed, scattered phenomena rippled through the region. Seismometers, as far south as Birmingham, detected periodic bursts of vibration originating near the ridge, each lasting precisely 42 seconds. Amateur radio enthusiasts reported bursts of static across multiple frequency bands, always beginning at 9:43 p.m. and ceasing at 9:44. And in towns along the plateau, household mirrors began to fog without temperature change, their surfaces trembling as if struck by an invisible pressure wave. A declassified internal memo from the Department of Energy, dated February 2024, acknowledges non-seismic oscillations correlated with magnetic fluctuations in the Wilder region. Its final line is heavily redacted but reads clearly, "If resonance persists, containment may no longer apply." Containment. The word suggests more than observation. It implies something being held back. What exactly Wilder Ridge has been containing for the past century is a question none of the agencies will answer publicly. But one overlooked piece of evidence offers a clue. A single reel of film found among Simmons's original effects in 1911, mislabeled and forgotten, until Parker's 2007 scan brought it to light. The frame sequence shows a crude wooden structure, likely the mine shaft entrance, surrounded by workers adjusting what appear to be horn-like devices affixed to copper tubing. The final frames, partially degraded, capture a faint shimmer in the background, like heat distortion on cold air. Beneath the image, written in black ink, are three words: "The door listens." In April 2024, during a rare interview, retired Oak Ridge scientist Howard Kess broke his decade of silence. Now, in his 80s, his voice trembled, but his memory was sharp. "They thought they were measuring sound," he said. "They weren't. They were measuring the threshold between perception and reality, a frequency that happens to sit right where our minds decide what's real and what isn't. When you hold that tone long enough, the barrier softens." That's what Simmons found. And that's what every team since has accidentally reopened. Kess paused before adding something that chilled the room. The pattern isn't calling out, it's calling back. 2 months later, Kess was found deceased in his Knoxville home. The official report lists cardiac failure, but the responding officer's notes mention something strange. Every clock in the house had stopped at 9:43. In June 2024, a Freedom of Information request revealed the existence of an unmarked data archive at the Oak Ridge facility labeled Project Wilder. The request was denied, citing classification under environmental resilience operations. A heavily redacted inventory list leaked soon after. Among the entries, 3 audio cylinders, unlabeled, 1 meteorite sample, reactive to sound, 4 sealed containment units, status active. The mention of the meteorite intrigued researchers, recalling earlier records describing strange metallic fragments found among Simmons's belongings. A private collector later claimed to have acquired one such fragment through an estate auction in the 70s. When examined under spectral light, its surface emitted faint pulses synchronized to the 18.9 Hz cycle. One technician described it as a metal that behaves like memory. That summer, a journalist named David Langley, no relation to the TVA engineer of the 60s, released a short documentary chronicling the Wilder story. The final scene shows him standing outside the fenced ridge, microphone in hand, describing the twilight air. "It's quiet now," he says, "but if you wait, you can feel the silence leaning toward you, like breath drawn before speech." Seconds later, the camera captures a faint vibration through the grass. Langley looks toward the hills. "It's happening," he whispers. The video cuts abruptly to black. He was reported missing the following week. Search teams found his camera half buried in mud near the ridge perimeter. The footage ends at the same moment as every prior record, 9:43 p.m. To this day, no one has been permitted to re-enter the Wilder site. The government maintains that the area is geologically unstable and unfit for public access. Yet, satellite imagery from late 2024 shows a new construction pattern. A ring of 12 reinforced structures, arranged with perfect geometric symmetry around the ridge. Each structure bears a ventilation stack, each precisely 18 meters apart. Their purpose is unknown. Locals who live close enough to see the faint glow of the floodlights call it the circle. They say that on windless nights, The air above it shimmers as though heat were rising from cold stone, and beneath it, barely audible, a sound trembles at the edge of hearing. A pulse so faint it seems to live not in the ear, but in the chest. 3 beats. A pause. 3 more. The sound of the ridge remembering itself. By autumn of 2024, the circle atop Wilder Ridge had become a fixation for both scientists and locals alike. Rumors swirled about what those 12 new structures were: seismic vents, exhaust towers, or antenna bases. But no one outside the government seemed to know. Official statements referred to them as stabilization pylons, a term that echoed the earlier dampening installations from 2022. Yet satellite photographs told a different story. Each tower cast an identical shadow at noon, indicating perfect alignment toward magnetic north, and when plotted together, they formed not a random array, but a geometric pattern, a ring enclosing the exact coordinates of the old Simmons mine. For a few months, nothing more was said. Then, in November, tremors began again, faint, rhythmic, and punctual. Local residents heard them at precisely the same time, 9:43 p.m. News outlets initially attributed the disturbance to underground machinery from the new installation, but the tone of their coverage shifted when homes miles from the site began experiencing synchronized vibrations. Glasses rattled on shelves, loose nails thrummed in boards, livestock refused to sleep. "It's like the earth's breathing again," said one farmer, echoing words spoken over a century earlier by the telegraph clerk who'd first heard the strange hum in 1911. The Department of Energy dispatched mobile monitoring units. Their technicians recorded what they called non-seismic ground waves, with a spectral composition matching that of the 18.9 Hz frequency. Their logs note that the vibration appeared strongest directly above the newly constructed pylons. One internal memo later leaked to the press read, "Resonance containment integrity compromised. Primary phase alignment has begun." On the 2nd of December 2024, without warning, the ridge's entire perimeter was sealed by a military cordon. Roadblocks went up along every access route, and aircraft patrolled the sky over the plateau. Residents were told the area had suffered a hazardous gas leak, but several witnesses living near the valley floor described seeing something that didn't fit any environmental explanation: a faint bluish-white light diffusing through the fog, rising from the ridge like an aurora that refused to fade. The phenomenon lasted only minutes, yet seismographs across Tennessee registered a harmonic event of extraordinary precision, a sustained pulse of 18.9 Hz, lasting exactly 60 seconds. Instruments sensitive enough to capture its overtones revealed a modulation consistent with human speech patterns. One analyst described it as the mathematical shape of language. Another called it a structured call. Then the silence began. For 48 hours, radio and internet communications within a 100-mile radius faltered. Not jammed, simply inert, as though the electromagnetic spectrum had been drained of momentum. Clocks malfunctioned, oscillating between seconds, refusing to tick forward. Power lines hummed at unnatural frequencies. A family living just south of the cordon reported that every mirror in their home fogged simultaneously, then cleared to reveal faint imprints: 3 vertical streaks, a gap, and 3 more. The pattern appeared not on the glass but within it, as if trapped between the surface and its reflection. When the blackout lifted, the military presence vanished almost as quickly as it had arrived. The following morning, the pylons were gone. In their place stood 12 open shafts descending into the ridge. Around them, scorched earth formed concentric rings of blackened soil. From a distance, they resembled the iris of a vast eye. No agency has admitted to constructing or dismantling those structures. The official environmental report filed afterward claims the tremors resulted from controlled subsidence operations to prevent sinkhole formation. But locals who braved the ridge days later described hearing something beneath the soil. Not a hum this time, but a pulse too slow and deep to be sound. A kind of pressure wave that made their hearts ache. One witness said it felt like standing beside an enormous heartbeat. Weeks later, on the 21st of December 2024, the winter solstice, the signal returned. Amateur radio operators across the Midwest detected bursts of low-frequency transmission emanating from central Tennessee. The pattern was unmistakable: 3 pulses, a pause, and 3 pulses. For the first time, however, the frequency had shifted. The core tone measured 18.89 Hz, subtly higher, as though the source were adjusting its pitch. When researchers modeled the waveform, they discovered something eerie. The new modulation formed a standing wave, whose mathematical structure mirrored the layout of the 12 pylons destroyed weeks earlier. "It's as if the ridge remembered the pattern," one analyst said, "or as if something beneath it is rebuilding the design from memory." Across the region, reports of auditory hallucinations spread. People claimed to hear faint, rhythmic tapping, even indoors, especially in structures containing limestone foundations. At first, these incidents were written off as mass suggestion, but physicians at Cumberland Hospital began recording consistent physical symptoms: elevated blood pressure, heart palpitations, and nausea, all peaking between 9:40 and 9:45 p.m. The hospital's lead neurologist, Dr. Amanda Crow, noted that several patients described identical dreams: a vast chamber of light beneath the ground, and a single voice repeating their own name backwards. Dr. Crow herself kept a private audio log detailing her experiences while studying the phenomenon. On her final recording, made December 30, her tone is calm but strained. "The pulse is present even in silence now. I feel it under my skin. It's slower tonight. Not calling, but waiting. If anyone finds this, do not try to measure it. It's not meant to be observed." The file ends mid-sentence, interrupted by a faint knocking sound. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. Her apartment was found undisturbed 2 days later. The clock on her desk had stopped at 9:43. By early 2025, Wilder Ridge was declared a closed federal reserve. Drones that ventured over its boundary reported GPS malfunction and camera distortion. One drone, operated by an independent journalist, managed to transmit 3 images before losing connection. The first, a swirl of fog over bare limestone. The second, a faint grid of light spreading across the ridge like veins. The third, a single flash of white radiance, followed by static. The timestamp on all 3 photos was identical: 9:43 p.m. In the absence of official explanation, the legend returned stronger than ever. The ridge became a pilgrimage site for believers, skeptics, and night wanderers who claimed they could feel the tone vibrating through their bones. They gathered along the fence line every evening, waiting for the hum. Most nights offered only quiet, the kind that makes one doubt their own hearing. But every so often, the stillness would break, not loud, but absolute, as the world seemed to tilt and the air itself began to tremble. 3 pulses, a pause, 3 more. It was no longer clear whether the ridge was producing the sound or whether the sound was producing the ridge. Whatever lived beneath Wilder had crossed beyond myth into physics, rewriting both the land and the people who refused to stop listening. And somewhere, between the static and the silence, the old voice of 1911, the miner, the machine, or whatever answered through it, still lingered, reshaping itself through new instruments, new frequencies, and new witnesses. Each century, the tone grew louder, not in volume but in certainty, as if approaching a crescendo only the hills themselves could hear. The date was now approaching another April, another alignment, another 9:43. And though the government's maps would show nothing but restricted terrain, the locals knew better. The door had never closed. It had only learned to hum in time with the turning of the earth. In the spring of 2025, just after the equinox, the ridge went quiet for the first time in months. The hum ceased. The tremors stopped. For nearly a week, sensors in the region recorded nothing. Not a flicker of vibration, not a breath of movement from beneath the limestone. Locals called it the hush, and for a moment, it felt as though whatever haunted Wilder had finally gone still. But those who had lived their lives under the shadow of the plateau knew that silence was never absence. It was intermission. On the evening of April 14th, the quiet ended. The first reports came from the southern slope. A faint flicker in the tree line, pale and rhythmic, almost like the slow pulse of a lantern swinging through fog. Moments later, seismographs across Tennessee recorded a harmonic signature, an 18.9 Hz resonance building from the subsurface, cresting not in a single burst but in waves, like breath drawn and released. The frequency did not plateau this time. It climbed. Across the region, lights dimmed. Radio signals bent and folded into static. Animals fled downhill in erratic patterns, as if guided by some unseen pressure. In the town below, people described the same sensation at once: the air thickening, the hairs on their arms rising, and an inexplicable certainty that something vast was aligning overhead. At exactly 9:43 p.m., the ridge emitted one long, sustained tone, pure, unbroken, and impossibly deep. Windows flexed, rivers stilled. And then, like the exhale of an entire century, the sound vanished. Satellite monitoring stations later confirmed that a brief electromagnetic pulse radiated from the site, disrupting orbiting weather sensors for nearly 30 seconds. When visual imagery returned, observers noticed a faint distortion above the plateau, a circular shadow against the clouds, rotating counterclockwise, dissolving within minutes. Ground patrols dispatched at dawn found no damage to the terrain, no new fissures, and no scorch marks. But the soil at the ridge's center had changed to smooth and metallic, fused into a single sheet of mineral unlike any known formation. Geologists analyzing core samples discovered something stranger still. At a microscopic level, the fused mineral contained perfect lattice patterns identical to human auditory waveforms, frozen mid-resonance. The stone had literally recorded sound, a tone solidified into geology. From that point forward, the Wilder frequency disappeared entirely from measurable instruments. No more infrasound, no more pulses. It was as if the land had spoken its final word and sealed it into its own body. Yet the silence that replaced it was not peace. It was presence. Visitors to the valley described an uncanny stillness, a wind that stopped mid-sway, echoes that failed to return, and a pressure in the chest, as though something immense waited just beyond perception. An internal memorandum, dated May 2025, leaked from the Department of Energy, lists Wilder Ridge as stabilized, containment, self-sustained. The phrasing suggested a paradox. Whatever threshold had been opened no longer required maintenance. The door, one note reads, now regulates itself. Weeks later, residents from as far as Knoxville began reporting an inexplicable recurrence of the 943 anomaly. Not sound this time, but light. At that exact minute each night, a subtle flash would ripple through electrical systems, porch lamps, street lights, and even the faint glow of digital clocks, all dimming for precisely one heartbeat before returning to normal. It was brief enough to ignore but too precise to dismiss, a rhythm written not in sound, but in illumination. Across academic circles, the Wilder case remains an unsolved convergence of geology, physics, and intertwined folklore. The prevailing theory holds that Simmons's 1911 experiments triggered a standing wave within the limestone cavity, one that fed on its own reflection until it reached self-perpetuating resonance. The more poetic interpretation, whispered among archivists and those who have stood at the ridge's edge, is simpler, that a message crossed through, and in hearing it, the world had to change shape to accommodate the reply. No official body speaks of the incident now. The access roads remain closed, and the maps are reprinted without the name Wilder. Yet those who have been there know you can still find the old telegraph post, half buried in moss, near the western slope. Its iron tip is rusted through, but if you place your hand against it at night, you might feel a pulse. 3 taps, a pause, and 3 again, faint as a heartbeat inside stone. Some say it's imagination. Others swear it follows the rhythm of their own breathing. The valley lives on in rumor. Hikers who claim to hear faint metallic knocking underfoot, drones that lose GPS lock above the ridge, and old tape recorders that switch on by themselves at 9:43 sharp. The sound never reappeared in the air, but it seems to have entered the people who listen. Perhaps that was the true purpose of Simmons's experiment all along, not to open a door outward, but inward, to prove that every human sense carries a threshold, and if one listens long enough, reality itself begins to harmonize with the listener. The boundary blurs, and what waits on the other side becomes indistinguishable from us. The official archive of the Wilder incident closes with one final entry, unsigned, dated March 2025. The handwriting is careful and deliberate, written in fading blue ink. The resonance persists in silence. The tone was never a sound. It was a question. We became the echo. And perhaps that is what the hills of Tennessee have been trying to tell us since 1911, that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only inherited. That silence, once it learns the rhythm of a name, never truly lets it go. So if you ever find yourself driving through that part of the Cumberland Plateau and your radio cuts out for no reason, check the clock. If the minute hand hovers near 9:43 and the air feels heavier than it should, do not stop. Do not listen. Keep driving. Because the ridge remembers those who pause to hear it, and every listener becomes part of the pattern. And if stories like this draw you in, if you believe some echoes are worth following into the dark, make sure you're subscribed. Because in the weeks ahead, we'll open more files from forgotten corners of America, where science, folklore, and fear still hum beneath the surface. Some doors were never meant to close,